Hi, everybody, and welcome to the next episode of our webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about abortion rights in Canada. And as usual, I'll start off with our land acknowledgement. So the Women's Resource Centre is located on Treaty 2 territory, and we also operate on Treaty 1 territory, which are the lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, Assiniboine, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and they're also the homeland of the Métis Nation. And our usual disclaimer that some of the content that you're about to hear might be upsetting for some folks, so please practice good self-care and step away or pause if you need to do that. So let's go over what we're going to be talking about today. So first, we're going to be talking about the history of abortion rights in Canada. Next, we're going to be talking about the seminal case of abortion rights, the Morgentaler case of 1988. Then we're going to move on to attempts to limit abortion rights in Canada. We're going to talk about the abortion rights movement and feminism. We're going to touch on crisis pregnancy centers. And finally, we're going to talk about the intersection of abortion rights and gender-based violence. So the history of abortion rights in Canada is a long one, but things really start to shift around 1969. So prior to 1969, all abortion was illegal. It was under the Criminal Code, Section 251, that abortion was not allowed under any circumstances. But with the 1969 amendments to the Criminal Code, some abortions were allowed under specific circumstances. There was something called therapeutic abortion committees that were used to determine if each case met the specific criteria that would allow for an abortion to take place. Abortions could only take place in hospitals. There were no legal abortion clinics. And the therapeutic abortion committees were comprised of 3 doctors. The doctors did not necessarily need to have treated or know the patient who was requesting an abortion. And essentially what therapeutic abortion committees would do is go over the case of the patient requesting the abortion. They would ask them questions in a sort of hearing-like manner, and then they would apply the criteria that would determine if the case met the requirements to allow for an abortion, and then they would either rule in favor of the patient and grant them an abortion, or they would deny the person an abortion. So this process, of course, was very fraught right from the start. The doctors on the therapeutic abortion committees didn't necessarily have to even know the history of the patient. They didn't have to have treated the patient. And the hearing kind of process was very adversarial. It was daunting for folks to be put essentially on trial for asking for an abortion. And they could ultimately be denied the care that they were asking for. And even if they weren't denied the care that they were asking for, this whole process really delayed the procedure taking place. And in some cases, that delay would, in and of itself, disqualify somebody from receiving an abortion because it would be beyond the gestational period where abortions were allowed. So in 1970, so shortly after these changes to the criminal code were made, there's something called the Abortion Caravan, which traveled cross-country from Vancouver to Ottawa to lobby for greater access to legalized abortion, free access to legalized abortion, and this was spearheaded by a feminist group. We're going to talk a little bit more in depth about it in a moment, but this was the biggest public demonstration, I suppose you could call it, advocating for abortion rights. And again, we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. 1982 saw the repatriation of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is the highest law in Canada. So no other law, whether it be federal or provincial, can conflict with the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It is the primary law that must always be upheld. And this is going to be important later. 1988 saw the Morgentaler decision by the Supreme Court of Canada, and this is really the watershed moment for abortion rights in Canada. This decision ruled that Canada's then abortion laws, restrictions on abortion, and criminalizing of abortion violated Women's Section 7 charter rights, which is the right to security of the person. And after this ruling came down in 1988, abortion was to be treated as any other medical procedure, so without prejudice or bias, and to be performed as any other medical procedure would be performed. And we're going to talk about Morgentaler a little bit in the next section as well. But I wanted to quickly highlight this quote that Chief Justice Brian Dixon of the Supreme Court wrote in the opinion that came out of the Morgentaler case. So he said, forcing a woman by threat of criminal sanction to carry a fetus to term unless she meets certain criteria unrelated to her own priorities and aspirations is a profound interference with a woman's body and thus a violation of her security of the person. So here he's referring to when he says she meets certain criteria, that's in reference to the therapeutic abortion committees that were in place prior to 1988, where, like I mentioned before, a panel of doctors would have to determine whether in each certain case a patient would meet criteria and allow her to have an abortion. And these were not related to whether the abortion was something that she wanted. It was related to the priorities of the medical establishment and the priorities outlined in the criminal code. And he cites that it's a violation of her security of the person, which is the Section 7 charter right. And as I mentioned, the charter is the primary law of the land here in Canada. Nothing can supersede the charter. So they're arguing that the abortion law that criminalized abortion was a violation of this primary law in Canada, and therefore it could not be upheld. So moving on to 1989, 1 year after the Supreme Court ruling, we had another Supreme Court ruling related to abortion. This time, the ruling was that a man has no right to attempt to veto a woman's right to choose abortion. And this is the Tremblay against Daigle case. So essentially, Daigle was pregnant, seeking an abortion. Tremblay was the father of the fetus and was attempting to argue that he should have the right to veto the pregnant mother's right to an abortion. And the Supreme Court of Canada ruled that the father of the fetus has no right to attempt to interfere with a woman's right to choose, that is solely her domain. So skipping ahead here to 2015, where we have our next kind of big moment in abortion rights, Health Canada approves the abortion drug mifegamouso, which is used to do medication abortion rather than surgical abortion, which prior to 2015 had been the primary way that abortion was carried out. But having access to this drug makes abortion a lot more accessible. And in 2017, mifegamouso became available to the public. And the provincial governments, not all of them, but several of them, began to cover the costs of the drug under provincial healthcare, which was a huge win for making abortion a lot more accessible. 2018 and 2020, we saw some developments in the designation of safe zones. They were established by law in Ontario in 2018 and in Nova Scotia in 2020. And these designated safe zones essentially prohibited protest, anti-abortion protest within certain distance of providers of abortion care. So clinics, hospitals, and pharmacies, now that we have the abortion drug. And this was an effort to improve safe access to abortion. As many times protesters, anti-abortion protesters outside clinics and hospitals were interfering with access to abortion care. So let's talk more about the Morgentaler case. I did mention it just briefly a moment ago, but since it was kind of the watershed moment in Canadian abortion rights, we're going to talk about it a little bit more in depth. So Dr. Henry Morgentaler was a doctor and abortion provider. Unfortunately, he passed away in 2013. But during the late 1960s into the 1970s and through the 1980s, he was a family doctor who converted his clinic in Montreal into an abortion clinic. And during the time he was practicing, abortion was mostly illegal. After 1969, as we talked about, abortions were only legal under certain circumstances, and they could only be performed in hospitals. So his abortion clinic outside of a hospital, without the purview of those therapeutic abortion committees, would have been illegal. So all of the clinics that he ended up opening across the country for abortion providers were illegal clinics, and he did have one in Winnipeg as well, actually. Dr. Morgentaler spent most of his career advocating for the full decriminalization of abortion and for increases in access to abortion and just women's rights in general. After a series of legal proceedings beginning in 1984, so he was actually arrested a number of times for conspiracy to provide abortion care. And the legal proceedings that began in 1984 spurred the Supreme Court of Canada decision that came down in 1988, which struck down Canada's prohibition on abortion in the criminal code. As we talked about, abortion, the criminalization of abortion was declared unconstitutional on the basis of that Section 7 charter violation. And this case, the Dr. Morgentaler case, fully decriminalized abortion, placing its regulatory responsibilities under the purview of provincial medical regulations. So abortion is no longer regulated by the federal government in any way. There are no restrictions on the federal level on abortion. And the provision of abortion care comes down to each individual province and what their medical regulations are and things like that. So yeah, as I said, there were no longer any restrictions on the circumstances under which an abortion could be procured or performed. So no gestational limit, there were no more therapeutic abortion committees. And after the ruling, abortion was to be treated like any other medical procedure, provided as necessary and without prejudice. So just like you would go to the doctor to have a mole removed, it should be treated just like that, where there's no judgment on the provision of that medical procedure. But because each province now administered the abortion regulations on their own, based on individual provincial regulations, unfortunately, abortion was still not equally accessible. And some maritime provinces, for example, still had restrictions on abortion long after 1988. So, for example, some of the maritime provinces still did not allow abortion to take place outside of hospital, which really put restrictions on access to abortion for rural folks. And there was, in some cases, costs still associated with abortion in maritime provinces, which also reduced access for folks who did not have the economic means to cover those costs. And even across Canada, outside of the maritime provinces, today, rural, remote, and northern communities had little to no access to surgical abortion. However, access to medication abortion did improve in 2017 when the abortion pill was approved by Health Canada and became available through pharmacies. So even though today rural, remote, and northern communities still have trouble accessing surgical abortion because a lot of the providers are located in hospitals or in clinics that are close to hospitals. And since those hospitals typically are situated in major population centers, major cities, access to surgical abortion is still limited for rural, remote, and northern communities. However, like I said, the approval of the abortion drug really helped to improve access to medication abortion, which is now how most abortions are performed. So there have been several attempts to limit abortion rights in Canada since the 1988 Morgentaler decision. There was a lot of resistance to changing the law on abortion criminalization, both immediately before and after that decision. And there have been several attempts, we're only going to talk about a few of them, to restrict the right to abortion in Canada and reopen the conversation on the legality of abortion. So one case took place in 1990 and 1991. A bill was introduced to the House of Commons to criminalize abortion providers, so doctors or clinicians who are providing abortion, and they would receive a 2-year jail sentence for providing abortions that were, quote, not medically necessary. And they defined that as where the pregnant person's life was not at risk. So not only were they restricting the ability of medical professionals to provide abortion, they were restricting the circumstances under which abortion could be legally provided, essentially taking us back to the 1969 criminalization of abortion, where it was only allowed under certain circumstances and only certain providers could provide abortion. This bill was introduced by Brian Mulroney's Conservatives, and while the bill passed in the House due to a majority, it did not make it past the Senate due to a split vote, and it died in the Senate, and it was never reintroduced. So 2007 saw another attempt to introduce an attempt to restrict abortion, to reopen the conversation on abortion's legality in Canada. So a private member's bill introduced by a Conservative MP called the Unborn Victims of Crime Act sought to allow separate charges to be laid if a fetus was injured or killed in the attack of a pregnant woman. And advocacy groups saw this as a step towards recriminalizing abortion, as it would grant legal personhood to a fetus and potentially criminalize pregnant women. There was another attempt in 2016 to do essentially the same thing. It was a private member's bill called the Protection of Pregnant Women and Their Preborn Children Act. This was seen by many as well as an attempt to resubmit the 2007 private members bill. The advocates who were speaking against the bill noted that the wording and the effect of the 2016 bill would have been nearly identical to that of the 2007 bill, making it another bill that would have covertly tried to open the conversation around recriminalizing abortion kind of through the back door. Both of these bills used a lot of anti-choice language. Both of them would have granted legal personhood to a fetus, which is incredibly problematic from a human rights perspective. And these examples that I've highlighted, the one in the 1990s and the two in the 2000s, are just a few of approximately 47 private members' bills that have been introduced into the House of Commons since abortion became decriminalized in 1988. So let's talk about the intersections of abortion rights movement and feminism. The Women's Resource Center is a feminist organization. We are openly pro-choice. We have always been a feminist and pro-choice organization. And so we think it's important to highlight the intersections between abortion rights and feminism. As I mentioned at the beginning, 1970 saw what has become known as the abortion caravan make its way across the country. So it was a mass feminist gathering that culminated in a ride across the country from Vancouver to Ottawa in order to advocate for the right to abortion, which, as we know, was not decriminalized until 1988. At this time in the 1970s, the recent amendment to the Criminal Code in 1969, which we've talked about, allowed abortion only under specific circumstances, only if done in a hospital, and only if approved by that therapeutic abortion committee. So what the abortion caravan was advocating for was free and equal access to abortion. And further changes to Canada's abortion laws were advocated for by feminists across the country. And these feminist groups supported wholeheartedly Dr. Morgentaler's efforts to continue to provide abortion care. And honestly, without the support of the feminist groups, Dr. Morgentaler's efforts perhaps would not have gone as far as they did. It was the support of feminist organizations and feminist groups that really made the difference for catapulting the issue of abortion rights into the sphere that it ended up in, which resulted in the 1988 Supreme Court of Canada decision. So yeah, as I mentioned, the abortion caravan came out of Vancouver in 1970. Specifically, it was spearheaded by the Vancouver Women's Caucus, which was a feminist group, and they advocated for the legalization of abortion in Canada and for free and equal access across the country. It's important to note that this movement was largely based in the white mainstream feminism of the time and was exclusionary to women of color, particularly to Indigenous women. And it really centered the views of white cisgender women and their views on feminism. They traveled from Vancouver to Ottawa, stopping along the way in other Canadian cities to engage in acts of civil disobedience, protest, and awareness raising around abortion. So holding events, marches, rallies, that kind of thing. However, when they arrived in Ottawa, parliamentarians, lawmakers refused to meet with them. But the caravanners found a way around this, and they snuck into the House of Commons gallery, where they were able to actually shut down Parliament, which was the first time that public interference had ever shut down Parliament in the history of Parliament. So since the decriminalization of abortion in 1988, feminist groups have still been fighting for free and equal access to abortion care countrywide because, as I mentioned, several provinces, such as the example that we talked about in the Maritimes before, still have restrictions on where abortion care can be provided and have not removed costs associated with the surgical procedure. It was also due to the lobbying of feminist groups that Health Canada approved the abortion pill in 2015 and that it became widely available in 2017. And many feminist groups continue to point out that rural, remote, and northern and Indigenous communities often lack access to abortion care, which makes this right one that's not universally accessible. So as you can see, the abortion rights movement and feminism are one entirely dependent and intertwined with each other. So let's talk a little bit about crisis pregnancy centers, because these are organizations that have come to the fore recently with regards to abortion rights and feminism. And I think it's important to highlight the current impediments that exist to accessing abortion in Canada, and crisis pregnancy centers in many ways are an impediment to accessing abortion care and the fulfillment of the right to abortion. So the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada defines crisis pregnancy centers. I'm going to be using the term CPCs as like a way to just shorten it a little bit throughout the rest of the presentation. So they say crisis pregnancy centers, sometimes called pregnancy resource centers, pregnancy care centers, or pregnancy help centers, are nonprofit organizations that present themselves as unbiased medical clinics or counseling centers for pregnant people. However, most CPCs are religiously affiliated anti-abortion agencies whose primary objective is to dissuade pregnant people from terminating their pregnancy. So they mention the religious bent of crisis pregnancy centers, and that is not harmful in and of itself. The right to religious belief is fundamental in Canada. What's problematic about it in this case is that crisis pregnancy centers, CPCs, are using religious beliefs to coerce or misrepresent information about healthcare and to attempt to restrict access to abortion and to impede accessing abortion rights. Canadians have the right to health, and Canadians also have a right to unbiased healthcare information, and CPCs get in the way of this. The Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada recently, earlier this year actually, did a study on CPCs, and they note that a common thread among CPCs is their presentation of themselves as benign and caring institutions, often coupled with a lack of transparency and truthful accounting of their organization's belief systems and scope of services. A large proportion of CPCs still do not explicitly disclose on their websites that they do not make referrals for abortion or contraception, nor that they are not a licensed medical facility. So this study that they did, they identified all of the crisis pregnancy centers in Canada. There was 146, and then they did a study of the language and content of the websites of these CPCs. And due to the fact that some CPCs shared websites because they were part of the same umbrella organization, they analyzed 143 CPC websites. And their main findings of this study were that 38.5% of CPCs did not have disclaimers that they don't assist with, refer for abortion or contraception. 5.6% of CPCs claimed a link between abortion and breast cancer, which is a claim that has been scientifically rejected. And it's also very dangerous to make that claim as it is medical misinformation. 18.9% of CPCs cited other medical risks for abortion that were exaggerated or not scientifically supported. So again, using that misinformation to try and coerce a decision other than the abortion that somebody is seeking. 75.5% of CPCs mentioned negative psychological consequences, primarily in the context of post-abortion distress, which is not a medically recognized syndrome or diagnosis. So again, using misinformation to try and dissuade folks from accessing the abortion care that they're after. 11.2% of CPCs claimed or implied that artificial contraception is unreliable. So by artificial contraception, they mean things like condoms, birth control, IUDs, those kinds of things, which are false. Artificial contraception has an extremely high success rate when used properly, and is extremely successful at preventing pregnancy. 13.9% of CPCs advocated for abstinence or discouraged sex outside of marriage, which is something that's just really not feasible for the vast majority of the population. It's not in line with most folks' belief systems. So again, just really advocating an ideological position that is not in line with what the majority of folks believe in. 81.8% of CPCs emphasized adoption or presented adoption as a better option to abortion. Yeah, there's quite a large conversation happening right now about adoption and whether that is the best option for folks who have unplanned pregnancies. And again, just trying to, this statistic really speaks to that CPCs are trying to coerce folks into choosing another option than the one that they are after, which is abortion. 74.1% of CPCs showed evidence of a religious outlook or agenda most openly, but 15% were not transparent or upfront about their religious motivations or affiliations. And again, like we said, it's not the religious outlook in itself that is problematic. It's using that religious outlook to peddle misinformation, to try and coerce folks, and not being transparent about it is goes against that right to unbiased information that folks have here. 42.7% did not have disclaimers that they were not a medical facility and or that clients should see a doctor for medical services, which is hugely problematic. They're kind of falsely professionalizing themselves and painting themselves to be something that they are not, which is very dangerous. 9.8% of CPCs indicated that they offered medical services, including STI testing or ultrasounds, again, misrepresenting themselves, professionalizing themselves when they should not be. 1.4% of CPCs mentioned or promoted or offered abortion pill reversal, which is unproven and potentially dangerous. So essentially, abortion pill reversal is the claim that essentially that CPCs can reverse the effects of the abortion pill, which again is completely unproven and can be very dangerous, especially because, as we know, these are not medical facilities. They do not employ folks who are medically trained. And yeah, that is extremely dangerous. 92.3% of CPCs offered programs or services not directly related to abortion, such as prenatal or parenting classes and other types of workshops. And 16.8% encouraged or required clients to participate in programs in order to access resources such as baby clothes. So again, using access to resources as a way to try and get to folks to convince them that they should not be getting an abortion. So we have 6 crisis pregnancy centers here in Manitoba, 1 each in Winnipeg, Portage-la-Prairie, Winkler, Altona, Morden, and 1 in Brandon. All of them do have a small disclaimer buried at the bottom of their websites or on a separate page that states they're not medical or counseling facilities and they do not offer help in arranging abortion care. However, most of them do say on their website that they offer counseling, quote unquote, services, even though they note that they're not counseling facilities. So that is a misrepresentation. Some emphasize post-abortion grief, which, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is not something that is medically recognized as a syndrome or diagnosis. And the locations in Morden, Winkler, and Altona actually on their website center the male perspective and voice on abortion rather than the female voice or the voice of the pregnant person, which is problematic given that we've seen that because of the Supreme Court of Canada ruling that the ability to decide whether or not to access abortion care should be solely dependent on the opinion of the pregnant person. And I would just like to read you a quote from one of the one of these crisis pregnancy center websites. It says, when it comes to pregnancy decisions, the choice is ultimately up to her, but you, the male, can make a big influence on her decision, which is hugely problematic that a crisis pregnancy center is trying to argue that women should try to be convinced to have a different outcome than the one that they're after. And the study, the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada study, sums it up nicely in this quote. They say Canadians have the right to their own beliefs and the freedom to share those beliefs. However, they do not have the right to present themselves as something they are not in order to coerce an outcome that aligns with their beliefs. So let's talk about the intersection of abortion rights and gender-based violence, because I feel like this is not something that gets talked about a lot, but there is very good reason to talk about it. And you might be wondering, what do abortion rights even have to do with gender-based violence? Quite a lot, actually. Free and equal access to abortion care can be critical and even life-saving for those who've experienced gender-based violence. And access to that accurate and unbiased information about healthcare, including abortion, it's not only a human right, as we've seen, but another critical and potentially life-saving measure for survivors of gender-based violence. So for example, in cases of sexual assault, somebody who becomes pregnant from that sexual assault may need to access abortion services. They also may need to first access accurate information on that abortion. And the unrestricted state of abortion in Canada allows survivors of sexual assault contemplating abortion the time and space to make the choice that they need to make without the pressure of any timelines or restrictions. So yeah, in situations of sexual assault, a form of gender-based violence, free and equal access to abortion care can be critical for somebody. And in cases of domestic violence as well, another form of gender-based violence, reproductive control is actually a specific type of domestic violence where the abuser tries to control when or if the survivor gets pregnant and or if they stay pregnant. So abortion rights being solely the choice of the pregnant person, which, as I mentioned, is protected in the Tremblay against Daigle case, are critical to ensuring the right to bodily autonomy is respected. Survivors of domestic violence who become pregnant may also need to access abortion care if they feel they're in a situation that would be unsafe to bring a child into. That's something that we hear happening. As well, survivors may not want to be tied to their abuser by a child and need to access abortion services for that reason. So through these examples of domestic violence and sexual assault, it's pretty clear that access to abortion care, access to unbiased information about healthcare, specifically abortion, is critical for survivors of gender-based violence. So that's all we've got for you today. As always, please feel free to contact us with the information below if you have any questions or concerns. Yeah, and join us next month for the next episode in our webinar series.